the story of First Samuel, it's actually the story of Samuel, the birth of Samuel. He is one of the great prophets of Israel, and chapter 1 gives us the story of his family of origin. And the chapter begins with some background on his family. We learn that Elkanah, who is Samuel's father, he is of the house of Ephrathite, and according to his family line, he was actually of the house of Levi, which is the house of the priests. Elkanah has two wives, one named Hannah and the other named Peninnah. And from the first few verses, we know a couple of details about his family. First, we know that Hannah was likely Elkanah's first wife. Because she is named first in the story. And so that means that Peninnah was Elkanah's second wife, whom he probably married because of the fact that Hannah was unable to bear children for him. And having an heir at that time was incredibly important. And so Elkanah most likely married Peninnah for the reason of providing him an heir. Another thing we know from the first few verses is that they were an honorable family. They were a family who showed great devotion to the Lord. This was a time in Israel's history when people were increasingly turning from the one true God, and they were sacrificing and they were worshiping idols. But Elkanah and his family, they were devoted to the Lord, and they showed their devotion by the fact that they went up year after year to give sacrifice to God. Sadly, though, another detail that we can see from these first few lines is that they were also a divided family. 1 Samuel 1 portrays strife that is present among them. And the cause of this strife is Elkanah's decision to have two wives. Though we see this kind of activity in the Old Testament where men are taking multiple wives, it is never affirmed by God for his creation. And so the division that existed in Elkanah's household was caused by the fact that he had two wives, and it centered primarily around these two wives, around Peninnah and Hannah. And it was stirred up because of two main causes in their family. First, being that Peninnah was able to have children. Verse 4 says, all of her sons and daughters would receive portions from the sacrifice they brought to the temple. So that tells us that Peninnah was able to have children. She had actually several children, while Hannah was unable to have any. And this caused problems between the two women. The other cause of division is that it seems that Elkanah loved and favored Hannah over Peninnah. In verse 4 and 5, again, it tells us that while Elkanah would give Peninnah and all of her children portions from the sacrifice, he would give Hannah a double portion from the sacrifice because he loved her. And these two things were the primary agitators of the strife and rivalry that happened amongst these two women. In verse 6, Peninnah is actually described as Hannah's rival. And so let's actually look at verse 6 and 7 and understand Hannah's situation from Hannah's perspective. It says this, and her rival, Peninnah, who used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. You know, I think it's easy for us when we read that to have compassion for Hannah because of her circumstance. Right? She is a woman who is married to a man. She likely loves her husband. It's pretty obvious that her husband loves her. But she is plagued by the inability to have children. And she's unable to give her husband an heir. And because of this, her husband marries another woman in order to secure an heir. And this was a pretty common thing that men would do in that time if their wives were unable to have children. But Hannah now has to share her husband with another woman who gives him what she could not give him. Right? And it was through no fault of her own that she couldn't give him what he wanted and really what she wanted. And on top of that, Peninnah does all that she can to intentionally provoke Hannah because of the fact that she can't conceive children. So there are multiple daggers in Hannah's heart here that she's dealing with, and her distress was purposely increased by Peninnah as she set herself up against Hannah as her rival. And verse 6 tells us that Peninnah would provoke Hannah grievously. She made it her job to seriously and significantly torment Hannah over the fact that she couldn't conceive. She would provoke Hannah to anger, it tells us. And, if any woman watching this has experienced difficulties conceiving a child, then you know what Hannah is dealing with. Apart from the provocation from Peninnah, just the sheer inability to conceive alone would have been torture for Hannah. My own wife and I, we struggled with infertility for about 5 years. And over that time, I experienced Kate's anguish over the inability to conceive a child. And I know from walking alongside my wife, the pain that a woman feels over her body not functioning as it should in this way is something that a man cannot fully comprehend. Like, I was walking with my wife, but I couldn't fully comprehend the pain that she was feeling. It is primarily a battle that is fought in loneliness, with tears and frustration and anger. And so Hannah is in her own world of anguish, and she is carrying a heavy enough burden without Peninnah inciting her on top of that. Right? And so what Peninnah is doing here is evil. And in fact, before we continue looking at Hannah's perspective, I want to look at Peninnah's character, because she's an example for us as well. I've called this sermon the example of Hannah, but Peninnah is an example for us as well. But she is an example of what a woman who is void of Christ-like character looks like. She is an illustration of a woman who, as Paul would say, is ruled by her flesh. And what I want to do is I want to actually point out 3 characteristics that are evident in Peninnah that are of the flesh, that are not of the Spirit of God. And so the first characteristic that we see in Peninnah is envy and jealousy. And I say envy and jealousy because they are 2 different things. See, envy is being unsatisfied with what God has given you. Envy is rooted in a lack of trust in God, and it asserts that what God has provided for you is not what you need and is not what is best for you. Envy causes individuals to look at another person and think, God made a mistake. What that person has, I should have. Envy is always from a place of sinfulness. Jealousy, on the other hand, is not necessarily sinful. And you may be like, what, really? Yeah, because God declared himself to be a jealous God. And he says, I am a jealous God. And so we have to take that to mean that jealousy is not always sinful. What jealousy is anger over someone else getting affections that belong to you. And so God is jealous when we give our affections to lesser things, when they really belong to him. He is a jealous God. In the same way, a wife may be jealous when her husband shows affections towards another woman, when those affections are rightly owed to her because of their marital commitment, because of their marital covenant with one another. And in fact, this is what Peninnah is likely experiencing. Elkanah married her, but he gives the share of his affections to Hannah. Meanwhile, Peninnah deserves the same affections that Hannah receives because she is also his wife. And she is jealous that she is not receiving the same affections. And again, this is why 2 wives is not God's design, right? But Peninnah's jealousy in itself is not a sin. Where it becomes sinful is in how she handles it. Peninnah decides to make Hannah suffer because she is jealous. And that is when it becomes sinful. You know, when individuals struggle with envy and sinful jealousy, it is from an outflow of a heart that is struggling with a feeling of lack. It is either a perceived inadequacy or an actual shortcoming. And we look at another person and we conclude they are better at something than us, or they have something that we should have, and we envy them. You know, when we envy another person, it roots from being unsatisfied with your own reality. And envy and sinful jealousy is pretty much the same with both men and women. But it is different in how it plays out in our lives. And the difference is actually kind of significant. And it has a lot to do with how men's and women's brains work. You know, back in 2001, Focus on the Family, they released a book by Bill and Pam Farrell called Men Are Like Waffles and Women Are Like Spaghetti. You may have heard of it, but it's a book that teaches about how the male and the female brain works differently. The male brain works much like a waffle, right? A waffle has individual squares that catch the syrup in it and contain the syrup, right? And the male brain is similar in the fact that men, we compartmentalize things. You know, one thought or issue or area, one thing that we think about or deal with, it doesn't necessarily connect to another area of our lives. It stays pretty much compartmentalized and contained. This is why, in general, men are not as good at multitasking as women. And I say in general because there are always exceptions to the rules. But because we keep everything kind of contained, we tend to have a more one-track mind, one thing at a time. On the other hand, women's brains are like spaghetti, right? If you look at a plate of spaghetti, everything is intertwined, everything is touching, and that's how a woman's brain works. Everything is intertwined, every thought, every issue, they are all connected in some way to every other issue. So when we consider this in regards to the effects that envy and that sinful jealousy have on men and women, the results are quite different for men and women. Right? For example, if a man isn't good at sports, you know, say a man isn't as good at sports as another man, he may envy that. Right? If he makes less money than another man, if he doesn't do as good of a job as another man, and so on, he will feel lack in that specific area, but it remains contained in that specific area of his life. For a woman whose every thought and issue is connected, envy and sinful jealousy doesn't just stay contained in one area. It is more likely to bleed into an overarching feeling of inadequacy, even though it only stems from one area of their life. For a woman, the feeling of inadequacy more easily becomes an identity issue. So while a woman may perceive a lack or have an actual shortcoming in, say, her housekeeping or her cooking abilities or at work or in her ability to rear children, it will more readily cause her to feel wholly inadequate rather than remaining in that one area like it does for a man. Women want to hit every area perfectly because every area affects every other area in their minds. And they struggle with inadequacy when they don't do this. And it is how you respond to these feelings that can lead to sinful jealousy and envy, which is what Peninnah gave herself over to. When she perceived a lack in herself because her husband loved Hannah more, she gave herself over to envy and sinful jealousy. She gave over to resentment. She harbored feelings of ill will toward Hannah. And in order to make up for it, she uses her greatest weapon against her. The greatest weapon that a woman has that can be used for good or for evil to build up or to tear down is your words. And instead of giving life through her words, Peninnah tore down. And so what about you? What do you do with the power of your words? The second characteristic that we see in Peninnah's life is pride, or a lack of dignity. Right? God desires to bless his people. God is a God who blesses his people. He showers blessing, right? And the problem with blessing sometimes is that if we don't have a Christ-like character, a blessing can very quickly become a snare for us. And that is what happened in Peninnah's life. Her pride turned the blessing of fruitfulness into a snare. She couldn't handle the blessing of the fruitfulness of her womb, the fact that she was able to have children when Hannah could not, and she became haughty and she became prideful. And because she possessed something that Hannah did not, she held it over her head. She made sure that Hannah was aware that she was better than her. She displays three things in her pride. She displays a harsh spirit, a desperation for attention, and a neglect of Hannah. And those three things are always signs that pride is alive and well in your life. If you have a harsh spirit, if you are desperate for attention, and if you neglect other people, you have a prideful spirit. And so how did these things show themselves in Peninnah's life? Well, she spoke harshly to Hannah, and she belittled her struggle. That's her harsh spirit. She shamelessly boasted about her own achievements. That was her desperation for attention. And she neglected Hannah in her weakness. She neglected others and thought only of herself. And James 4:6 says, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Daughters of the Most High God are called to be humble, not haughty, not prideful. And so how are you doing in this area? How is your humility? Do you speak harshly? Do you have a harsh spirit? Do you speak harshly to your husband? Do you speak harshly to your children? Do you work to get attention, maybe through how you speak or how you dress? Do your needs and your wants come first? Do you neglect others? If these things are alive in your life, then pride may be alive and well. And again, Hannah is going to show us a better way. And the third characteristic that we see in Peninnah is a lack of love. In fact, you could probably say that the lack of love is the cause of the other two characteristics. And I want to look at the definition of love in 1 Corinthians 13 for a moment. It says, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. You know, if we compare that list with Peninnah's character, well, Peninnah is envious and boastful. She is arrogant and rude. She is resentful. She rejoices in wrongdoing. She does not bear with nor endure. It is the opposite of Christ-like character. In love, Jesus Christ took our weight of sin upon his shoulders, and he died bearing the weight of our evil on the cross. Like, he took the greatest burden that all of us had, sin, and he put it upon his shoulders, and he carried it for us because we couldn't carry it. And Paul says to followers of Christ in Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. right? We are called to bear one another's burdens, to carry one another's burdens. And anytime you do something to increase the burden of another, you are in direct opposition to Jesus. Like 1 Corinthians 13 isn't just a plaque with nice words that hangs on so many people's walls. It is a rule of love for the life of the follower of Christ that our Heavenly Father gives us and expects us to meet it. We do everything we can to remove burden from the life of other people, because that is what Christ did for us. And yet we see Peninnah constantly trying to increase Hannah's burden. A godly woman will never do that. She will do everything she can to remove the burden from another person. Just a couple last notes on Peninnah here. Peninnah is relentless, right? Like Scripture says, year after year. This isn't a one-time thing. This isn't like, oh, she sinned in a moment. This is year after year. Peninnah is tormenting Hannah. And maybe worst of all, which shows how hard Peninnah's heart is, look at where she does such things. Verse 7 says, as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Your Heavenly Father has a lot to say about how men and women should act in His house, and Peninnah is in opposition to all of it. Peninnah takes the opportunity when she should be worshiping God to instead attack Hannah. And I can tell you, it is a hard heart that is harsh towards others, that is uncaring towards others, even in the house of God. And so I caution you, how do you act in God's house? How do you act in your Father's house? How do you act when you are around others? When you're gathered with the church? Your actions are to be informed by the fact that you are gathered with your Father's children. Do you give special consideration to those around you? Do you consider them as better than yourself? Do you live selflessly for the sake of others? Peninnah is not an example of godly character. Flee from such things. Now let's look at the example of Hannah. We already looked at verse 6 and 7, which describes how Hannah was provoked by Peninnah. And I want us to focus in on a particular word in verse 6. It tells us that Hannah was provoked to anger. Now, the Hebrew word that was used to describe Hannah's anger is a word that is predominantly used to actually describe the anger of the Lord towards Israel as a response to their disobedience towards Him. 80% of the time that this word is used in the Old Testament, it portrays this kind of anger, of God's anger towards Israel for their rebellion. And so that tells us that it is an anger that is justified. The Lord was undoubtedly justified in His anger towards Israel's disobedience. Right? And Hannah is justified in her anger for the wrongs committed against her by Peninnah. And we see that she is deeply affected by what Peninnah is doing to her and the relentless provocation that she is facing. It says that she weeps and she doesn't eat. And so Hannah is feeling the weight of this. And at this point, a lot of you are probably thinking, man, Hannah needs to stand up for herself. Or like she needs to go back at Peninnah. Like she needs to tell this woman off. And she would be justified to absolutely rip her apart. Right? That's where a lot of our minds go. But I want to caution you. Do not let your cultural sensibilities determine how Hannah should respond. And moreover, do not let your cultural sensibilities and personal inclinations decide how you respond in a situation where you are angry or upset or maybe justifiably wronged. Hannah's anger may be justified. But if she responds wrong, she will be just like Peninnah. And her anger will become sinful. God warns us, be angry and do not sin. You know, our first instinct in Hannah's situation is we think Hannah needs to say something. Or like she needs to fight back. She needs to defend herself. But slow down a minute and consider, what does God say? Hannah will show us a much better path. And it is a way that rails against our flesh and our desire to defend ourselves and fight for our rights and point to how we've been wronged. See, Hannah, she refused to give over to a hardness of heart that demanded justice from Peninnah. She refused to allow her situation to be a door that led to sinful behavior. Instead, Hannah showed immense godliness and immense strength. You know, it requires a lot more strength and self-control to deny your flesh. Right? Deny that urge to defend yourself. Deny that urge to fight back. That's a lot stronger than just pressing into it. And in verse 10, we see Hannah's better way. Her impeccable example of Christ-like character. With all of her torment, with all of the injustice, with the struggle over the inability to conceive, with the attacks that were coming from Peninnah, her immense pain, her anger, all she was feeling, everything that was going on with her, what does she do? She turns to the Lord and she prays. In verse 10, she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She took all of the injustice, she took all of the frustration, the anger, the weariness, all that she felt that could have lit fires of sin within her, and she turned to the Lord and allowed those things to ignite the flame of prayer instead. And she prayed and she wept and she pleaded and she poured it all out before the Lord. And this is the better way. This is the better way for all of us. And I want to show you why from her prayer in verse 11. This is what Hannah prays. She says, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but I will give to your servant a son. Then I will give him to the Lord all the days of my life, and no razor shall touch his head. And I want to just look at the very beginning of that prayer. Look at what Hannah uses for the name of the Lord when she addresses him. She calls him the Lord of hosts. And this is the first time in the Old Testament that this name of God is used. But it will become a name that is well used by the nation of Israel when they were in need. And it means that God is the host of heaven and earth and all creation. Everything is under his authority. And when Hannah addresses him in this way, she is recognizing him as the Lord of hosts of heaven's armies. And Hannah goes to the Lord, and what she is doing here is what we all need to do. And she declares, you are the one who fights my battles. You are the defender of my soul. You are the one who has the power of heaven's armies behind you. You are the one who will defend me. It is not up to me. I bring everything to you, and I lay it down. And that is the better way. When we look for a quick victory by defending ourselves or going on the offensive against those who wrong us, we may win in a moment against an earthly opponent, and that makes us feel good for a second, but we will ultimately lose against the battle of sin, because sin will reign in those moments. Jesus said, when someone slaps your left cheek, turn to them your right. When someone takes your tunic, give him your coat as well. And we, in our North American mindset, are really bad at doing this. We love to defend ourselves. We love to stand up for ourselves. We love to stand up for what we believe is right. But you have a heavenly Father who fights for you. But so often we don't allow him to fight for us because it satisfies our sinful nature to complain and to speak harshly and to fight back ourselves. But that is the way of the flesh. And I believe that what the Lord revealed to me through this story of Hannah is that when you do that, when you choose to defend yourself instead of allowing God to fight for you, it empties your prayers of power. Why do I say that? We so often take our complaints and our frustrations in the heat of the moment to a friend or a spouse or someone who will listen to us rage and complain because it feels good. And then maybe we will go to God later after we've dumped all of our emotion on another person. And in so doing, what we have done is we have emptied our power of prayer. Why? Because imagine the power of your prayers if you take all of that emotion directly to the Lord like Hannah did, crying out, fervently praying, fervently asking the Lord to intervene. Instead, we complain to everyone else. If we went directly to Him, we would have a power that we don't currently have because we would communicate the emotion, we would communicate that sting of injustice, that energy that we would normally extend ripping into another person, we would bring it to the Lord. Instead, we go to the Lord after yelling at our spouse or telling another person off. We fight our own battles and then we go to God. But God has told us not to do this. The Lord is the one who fights your battles. So let Him. And when you do, I wholeheartedly believe one of the things that will happen in your life is you will put off sinful jealousy. You will put off sinful anger. You will put off sinful envy because you no longer feel the need to defend yourself and fight for you. You bring it to the Lord. Hannah displays the way of godliness for all of us in this chapter. She is an incredible example of a godly woman. And I want to just end with just a few quick observations from Hannah's life. First, Hannah speaks to the Lord in her heart, it says. Her lips are moving, but she's not speaking out loud. Hannah is recognizing that the Lord knows the heart. We must remember that the Lord knows the heart. He knows the challenges. He knows the struggles. He knows the temptations. And we must be quick to bring those to Him because He already knows that they're there. And that's what Hannah does. She doesn't attack her husband. She doesn't try and release those things somewhere else. She takes them to the Lord who already knows her heart. Second, verse 18 is absolutely fascinating to me. It says, after Hannah prayed, she received the priest's blessing. And it says that then the woman went her way and she ate, and her face was no longer sad. Hannah went from just torment and anger and pain, and she brought her case to the Lord, and she walks away content, eating. Her face is no longer sad because she had faith that she brought her troubles to the Lord and she committed her case to God, and then she trusted in His will. She trusted that He would do what was right. She left it with Him and she let it go. Third, verse 20 is another incredibly fascinating verse to me. It says that Hannah returned home and she was intimate with her husband. And look at those two words in verse 20. And in due time, the Lord remembered Hannah. In due time, the Lord remembered Hannah. We want justice now when we are wronged. We want our own way now. And the Lord says, no, I will work it all out in due time. How well do you submit to the Lord's timing? Because if you are a follower of Christ, you can know He has promised you that He will work all things out for your good. And that will happen in due time. And the last thing that I see that I think is so important is that Hannah, she had a deep desire on her heart. She wanted a son. But she also recognized that her desire has to be bigger than just her. Right? In her prayer, she vowed if the Lord would give her a son, that she would dedicate that son back to Him. And this is what we talked about a couple weeks ago. Right? We have to know, like, what is the end of what we're praying for from God? What is the end of what we're asking for the Lord to give us? Because Jesus says, you will receive anything that you ask in my name, but our end has to be the same as His, to the glorification of our Father in heaven. Right? And so Hannah recognizes this. And so Hannah prays out of her desire with also an eye to glorify God in heaven. She says, Lord, if you give me this son, I will give him right back to you. And the Lord was pleased to answer her prayers. And the cool thing about it is that God answered Hannah's prayer. But while Samuel was an answer to Hannah's prayer, he was also an answer to Israel's need for a prophet. And he would bring great glory to the Lord. You know, envy and jealousy, they can't take root in a heart that understands that whatever gifts we have are from the Lord. That, like Hannah, whatever thing we give back to the Lord was His already. And she recognizes that. This is the example of Hannah. A beautifully godly woman.